Hello, everybody. Welcome to the stream. I'm here with the other CP, classical theist, who has a excellent YouTube channel and Twitter presence. Definitely go check that out. So I figured I'd bring him on just because there's a lot of talk about it. I was talking about it with Serp. I've done some videos on it. Just how as Christians, because I know most of my audience is Christian, particularly Catholic, we should view voting or just participating in modern liberal democracy. Um, is it right? Like, is it morally okay to do it? Do we have an obligation to do it? Do we have an obligation not to participate in it? These are all very difficult questions because I know, for instance, one time during Pride Month here in Toronto, pretty much every business has a flag. And when I went to confession, I said, like, I feel guilty that I'm, like, patronizing all these businesses that are actively promoting objective evil. And I mean, the priest said I was just being scrupulous and, like, I shouldn't feel bad about it. But I think these are questions a lot of people are really asking themselves. So, do you maybe just want to introduce yourself, what you do, and then I guess we can kind of go into your overall view of this?
Yeah. Well, it's good to talk to you as always, man. My YouTube channel is called Classical Theist. I make a lot of videos about Thomistic philosophy, Thomistic theology, and trying to um, sort of combat secular philosophies and such. Um, and I also have a Twitter account. It's at Classical Theist without the T because somebody else took that username, so I had to. So it looks a little awkward, but so I'm also on Twitter. Um, but yeah, I mean, as to this issue of voting, um, there are there's like certainly this subgroup of traditional Catholics who seem to think that because the church traditionally comes from a very powerful anti-liberal persuasion,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm thinking primarily of the 19th century popes. Um, they came out very strongly, especially Pius IX and Gregory XVI, against uh, classical liberalism, as we call it. That therefore, in any attempt to participate in the democratic process is somehow akin to formally cooperating with some kind of a structurally and systemically anti-Catholic um, political system. And while, of course, I think it is true that traditionally, if you want to be a Catholic, you should have very strong reservations about the prospects of democracy, the whether or not it has any kind of congruence with the natural law, these kinds of things. Um, but it's not so simple. Even as a political system in and of itself, I could quote Pope Leo XIII in his encyclical Immortali Dei, who says, the church does not necessarily condemn any one system of government, um, but that every or most systems, including democratic republics, they can be integrated within a broader uh, uh, system that could implement faithfully the natural law. So, in other words, even though you have systems that are less ideal than others and work better or worse than others, uh, most of them are at least in principle redeemable. So that's number one. That participating in the democracy as such could not be construed even by 19th century papal teaching as somehow formal cooperation with evil. Now, what we have now is obviously political systems that are just uh, woefully beyond the pale of even having a hope that they would ever be in harmony with the natural law, right? But the question is, are we formally cooperating with the perpetuation of those systemic evils by participating in the current trajectory of those systems. And I don't think we necessarily are. And this is why the church, generally speaking, doesn't issue out condemnations for voting. There was, of course, many people will cite Pius the Ninth and his non expedite condemning voting in the Italian parliamentary elections. But even with that, by the time it came to Leo the 13th, he said there could be a justifying circumstance under which voting in those elections would be legitimate. And I think, and obviously that non expedite has since been, completely abrogated shortly thereafter. But the point is, even when you have a situation where the democratic choices are just beyond any kind of hope for harmony with natural law, you can still participate so as to avoid the worst case scenario. And this would be, there are a number of levels of cooperation with evil. There's a formal or direct cooperation with evil, which is defined as, I have it up right here, it's either participating directly or voluntarily in the evil, or ordering, advising, praising, or approving of the evil, or protecting evildoers. But I don't think voting necessarily amounts to that, because you're not really in any way participating in the policies that you might have to tolerate or permit for the sake of some greater good. You're just, in your own intention, preventing, we could say, worse evils. So I think it would fall much more under what you would call remote material cooperation with evil, which would be an act by which the cooperation is rendered is not itself sinful, so you're not participating directly in those bad policies, which has two effects. You have the good one that is chosen and the bad one that is tolerated. And then there is a proportionately serious reason to justify tolerating the evil. And we can talk about what's at stake maybe in the upcoming election that can maybe help put the abstract into a bit more concrete relatability. But I guess that's what I'd say in the abstract to lay out the principle here.
Okay, so let's just go through that because there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to go
Oh
on.
no,
But
no, that's fine. No, that's good.
It is a lot to elucidate.
No, that's good. I was just making some mental notes. So like what you said about systems not being, I guess kind of just the first thing to keep in mind is all systems have problems because we're all fallible, corrupt humans. Like a system
Right.
can be in line with natural law, but the people who make it up are like I guess more corrupt or more criminal than average. I think the more issue is that the systems we're facing today are intrinsically evil in that they promote like as a it's not a bug, it's a feature of the system.
Yeah.
The kind of things that happens and just to like with regards to democracy, I mean, people probably wouldn't consider it democracy, but you did have republics in Italy and that kind of thing where they did have elections. Obviously, they didn't function like modern democracy in any way, but you did have elected representatives.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I'm by no means even implying that traditional teaching would be against democratic elements of the system, but what we have now is just the mass democratization of everything.
Now, someone asked, what about socialism and communism?
Yeah, well, I mean that gets into a whole other you know can of worms, but um, I mean I think right now the an obsession with condemning socialism I think might be a little tone deaf to the circumstance that we're facing right now.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, in the abstract, clearly popes have consistently condemned both socialism and communism.
Well, once again, it's kind of like when you're talking about capitalism.
Yeah.
Like, I think, did Franco refer to like his economic system as socialism, or
Yeah.
I like, depending on your definition, you could argue like Francoist Spain was the most socialist government of all time because it was very heavily worker owned. Like in terms of workers controlling the means of production, it's just kind of a very nebulous concept. Communism.
And there's a lot of flexibility in terms of what Catholic teaching allows for when you're talking about like economic systems.
Right. Our mutual friend Terrellian likes to say the church doesn't have any particular insight into economics as a, I don't know if scientific discipline's the right way to put it, but
Right, and if you consider like economics a, a science, then there is a lot of material there that's just always going to be extra magisterial. You know, I mean, the magisterium can jump in to uh, insist on protecting workers' rights or ensuring that private property is preserved. These kinds of things,
mhm.
these kinds of general principles. But in terms of implementation, it's I would say I would say there's a lot more flexibility in that domain than a lot of Catholics on both the left and the right would acknowledge. And when I say left and right, I mean in the colloquial sense, obviously.
Yeah, because I mean, completely lost my train. Yeah, the church doesn't have any particular insight as to what the marginal tax rate should be, or
Right. Yeah.
something like that. Um, okay, so we have that. For material cooperation of evil, would that would that include like if you work at a convenience store that has like uh, dirty magazines?
Yeah. I mean, that's gets into some tricky territory. I mean, I don't. I think so long as you're not the one uh, organizing them
Mm-hmm.
or um, displaying them, then I think that would definitely be remote material cooperation because you're not seeking to perpetuate the displaying of lewd magazines. You're just working at the place that happens to display those there.
Right. Yeah, and I guess I feel guilty whenever Pride Month rolls around. I don't think Americans can really understand just how like it's worse than San Francisco here.
Now, I've seen your videos where you walk around, and well, it's basically a glimpse into our own future, but it's it's brutal. I've seen where you just walk around and like there was this one with like what was it this rabbit in the display case
Oh yeah, with
with
the carrot dildo.
yeah, it's brutal. It's brutal.
And it's just like if I want like to get a meal or something and I go into McDonald's and they have like the rainbow flag and stuff,
Yeah.
I just can't help but kind of feel guilty.
No, I've
Uh,
had those scruples too, but I think what we have to realize is every single nook and cranny of the system is global homo.
mm-hmm.
So you're not going to escape it. So I think if you're just patronizing a sorry, that's my cat. If you're just patronizing a business for their service that is in and of itself unrelated to degeneracy, it's fine.
Right. But no, I'm just saying like that. I think that's kind of transitioning. I think a lot of people feel And this goes from like paying taxes, because your taxes indirectly provide abortions, or indirectly in, I don't know how it works in the US, but in Canada, in Ontario, the government can take away
Hmm.
your 6 year old if you don't let them have a
Well,
trans surgery.
like when you say, I mean, personally, I don't, I definitely don't think it'd be a sin to like be not pay your taxes in this day and age. But I will say, uh, when you use the word directly, the government may directly do that, but I don't think paying taxes is a direct cooperation in what the government does with that money, because the transaction is basically you pay in order to sustain your citizenship. I mean,
Mhm.
obviously you don't cease to become a citizen if you don't pay your taxes, but you uh, you pay in order to um, uh,
You live in a
essentially fall within the
society.
law, right?
You live in a society, and you have to pay
Yeah,
for the right.
and that's those are the terms of the transaction. It's not like you pay so that abortion can be funded. It's you pay the government as a um, prerequisite, or, well, not as a prerequisite, but as a requirement for uh, being a citizen in good standing, and that's what you get in return,
Right, and there's a lot
right?
of
So
other
it's not
essential
really
things.
you
Yeah.
paying for abortions. It's you're paying the government as a requirement for being a citizen in good standing, and then they do terrible things with it.
Right, and I think, and this is kind of a moral principle that I hadn't really thought of that much until our mutual friend Terrellian kind of really hammered it home, that you're not responsible for things other people do. Um,
Hmm.
so if you pay your taxes with the understanding that it's going to fund things like police, water,
Right.
roads,
These very
and
basic necessities. Yeah.
yeah, and then they turn around and they use it for bad stuff.
Yeah. I
That's
mean,
not directly your fault.
and it goes back to what Christ said. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and that the very concept, of paying a tax is ancient, and I think it's one of those things that is just an essential element of society, which the citizens pay so that they can reap the basic benefits of what a society offers. And just because the the government, the state, may use those funds for nefarious purposes, that those are kind of outside the scope of what just the essential nature of the transaction is.
Yeah, what you're responsible for. I guess maybe it's an intent thing. So if you like are
Yeah.
like, oh boy, I'm giving money to the government to
Right.
fund
Yeah.
Planned Parenthood.
Then you're going to hell. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's that aspect. So I think some people feel that voting is maybe a step above that. So, like, maybe let me just paint a
Hmm.
scenario, because I'm sure it's like this in a lot of places. So, there's more or less a consensus in Canada. Canada and America, I think, have the most liberal abortion laws on earth. You can correct me on that
Oh
if
yeah. Like Europe is actually somewhat more decent.
Canada, I think, has no laws whatsoever. In America, it's like a mess. I don't entirely understand how it works there, but it's a consensus in Canada beyond everybody but a couple social conservatives who are marginalized that
Yeah.
the abortion issue's closed. And like what happens in our government is we do have practicing Catholic politicians who are personally pro life. Like we had Andrew Scheer, who is a pretty devout guy. He has like 6 kids. And he said, I'm personally pro life, but I understand it's a settled issue and I'm not going to reopen it.
Did he get killed for that? Essentially.
Yeah, it's one of the main reasons he lost the election.
Oh, jeez.
Or because that was interpreted as um, I'm going to ban all abortion in um, in Canada. So There's that. We also had Kelly Leach, and she was a
Mhm.
doctor. When she was writing, she said, "Look, as a pediatrician, I know that it's a baby, but I get that it's a settled issue." So I guess the thing is, people might consider that, like, even in that case, voting for someone
Right.
who's theoretically pro-abortion.
Now, I have a few things to say about this.
Mhm.
The first thing is, I think it's a little bit anachronistic to see abortion as the only issue on the table for a Catholic. And let me explain what I mean by that.
Sorry, just one. Is that a like a straw man to say? So a lot of people think that way,
Yeah,
or is it not? I mean, because I.
well, it's that can be said in two ways. Like it can be said from this perspective of like a Catholics for choice, like heretic,
Mhm.
and that's not what I mean. What I mean is, in recent years, there's been the emergence of new issues that are very, very pertinent to, I would say, Catholic survival. And that would be, particularly in the United States, the prospect of like a democratically controlled Congress and White House essentially rendering the First Amendment neutralized,
Mhm.
which would effectively uh, give free rein for the state to persecute the church. And I think this is an issue that is new. It wasn't around at the time, of when the non-negotiables of abortion, same-sex marriage, euthanasia, etc. were discerned. This issue is a bit new, right? The radicalization of like the Democratic Party is is a recent trend, and it's leading to a point where you could very clearly see in the foreseeable future hate speech legislation, which would essentially make like the propagation of the Catechism of the Catholic Church or something uh, illegal on the grounds of hate speech. And I think that should, not that it would sideline the abortion issue, but I think we have to consider more issues as directly pertinent to the survival of the Catholic Church in the United States. Not just the Catholic Church as an institution, but our ability to faithfully live out the doctrines of the church and to evangelize and such. So I think that's one thing to say. Um, Now, on the issue of abortion itself, uh, I would quote Pope John Paul II, whose encyclical Evangelium Vitae, he addresses this very issue, specifically to politicians who are voting on abortion legislation. He says, if there is, if you receive a law that is, um, it at least states its opposition to uh, the availability of abortion services on some level. So, in other words, its intent is to reduce abortions. Its intent is to restrict abortion in some capacity, but it's not like all the way pro life. It's not all the way fully, absolutely speaking, anti abortion. The politician can vote for that legislation because it's, by virtue of the doctrine of double effect, the direct action is the restriction of abortion services, and you're permitting the evil of, you know, the rest of the abortion services that the legislation doesn't ban. You're allowing that to remain in place, right? So I would apply that directly to voting in elections, right? Um, President Trump clearly, I mean, you know, his presidency, from the standpoint of someone, the distant right, isn't exactly uh, hasn't done everything he wanted. I will say he's doing a lot better in the last few months of his first term. But that aside, he actually, I think, has done a lot to, um, at the very least, hold off the tide of just radical pro-abortion ideology from taking power. or taking back power. And the fact that he has policies, he has a platform that is at the very least ostensibly opposed to abortion, and he's actually done, uh, you know, executive orders and such to, limit funding to Planned Parenthood, to the Mexico City policy, to appoint judges that would be pro-life. He actually has done that. The Supreme Court nomination now replacing Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that's very big. Um, so I think, given what Pope John Paul II said, we can apply that principle to the election. Are you going, if your main issue is abortion, are you going to vote for the candidate that at least is trying to do something to restrict it on some level? Or are you going to sit this one out and thereby allow the just radical, just anti-Catholic party to come in and not only enshrine Roe v. Wade into law, actual federal law, because that's what Joe Biden said he wants to do, and on top of that, push for hate speech legislation to essentially target your ability to live out the faith. So I think it's really a no-brainer, frankly.
Right. I mean, let me just. So, I'm just trying to think. Like, an example in Canada is. So, the legislation Justin Trudeau brought in does not make a moral or religious exception for euthanasia. Um, so, if you're a doctor, you either have to perform it or you have to find someone to perform it for you.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just flat out refuse. And like at my parish, I do a Bible study with a conservative priest, and he was just like, "Look, I'm just gonna say, the conservatives on this one, they're not gonna do anything about a lot of these other things, but they're for having a religious exception on euthanasia."
Mm-hmm.
Um, so like that's kind of a case. I think in terms of that, now a lot of people are saying in the chat, and people have been saying that the Supreme Court nominees don't matter because realistically they're all going to vote to keep abortion, or
I mean,
most of
okay,
them.
like, look, on abortion, I can kind of see where you might have that argument. Although I will say, um, you know, with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's replacement and potentially a Breyer replacement in the future, that would at least make it a little bit more likely. Okay, like you can't say that it wouldn't make it any more likely. Um, Nevertheless, you even if I grant what you say on the abortion issue, there's so many others, like on just religious liberty. Now, I know as a traditional Catholic, we object to principled religious liberty in the sense that we don't think that error has any rights, but the church has always been for her own protection, and that's what I would argue the true spirit of a Dignitatis Humanae from Vatican II. It's to protect the church's rights, and I think when you have a very real threat of um, the church being uh, legally prevented from propagating her own doctrines and applying her own doctrines, it does help to have a Supreme Court that could protect the First Amendment. And I think, if you say that these nominees fail on abortion, I don't think they're going to fail on the First Amendment. Now,
Yeah,
now, now, now Gorsuch has been kind of upsetting, but I think he could be. I think even that's why the Ginsburg replacement is important, because it basically would hopefully nullify Roberts' swing vote, and
Roberts is the worst
yeah, he
because he's a
really is.
Judas, and there's nothing worse than that.
Yeah, I mean he's basically the new Kennedy.
Sorry, just the meme for a second. I kind of wish they just abolished the Supreme Court and just make Clarence Thomas the Supreme Judiciary.
Just make him the philosopher king.
Yeah. Sorry, just a side note. We're talking about the Supreme Court. So I kind of feel that Clarence Thomas is the best justice, even more so than Scalia.
Well, yeah, he definitely was better than Scalia because I think didn't Clarence Thomas like reject stare decisis?
I'm not sure, but my understanding is, regardless of what he kind of says, he tends to just do natural law votes.
Yeah,
Um,
which
he
is based.
he places that above precedent. Whereas I don't have it in front of me, but I think Scalia voted like with the left of the court on issues because of precedent.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that's where stare decisis comes in, and yeah, I know that Scalia would say all the time that he believes in it, whereas Thomas, I think he was a lot more reliably uh, textualist, yes, but I think as you said, he he did think that natural law had like a right to have some kind of a say in those decisions.
right, and I do like, as bad as the Supreme Court is, I still kind of hold out hope that they wouldn't declare the Second Amendment means that no one can have guns, or that you can't read the Bible, or like that they would at least nominally protect free speech
Yeah, I
compared
mean,
to
I
the
consider
others.
that to be like one of the non-negotiables at this point because, as we hinted at earlier, what they want to do is make it illegal for you to say like, I'm not really on board with, you know,
Kids getting their dicks chopped off.
cuties or whatever.
Um, but something I say, sorry for getting a little off topic, but Supreme Court picks matter globally because most tech companies are based in America. And as much as they censor, if they were based somewhere like China, I think it would be much, much worse. Um,
Yeah.
like if they were based in a country that didn't have the First Amendment.
Now,
Um,
I will say on tech companies, um, I don't know how a justice, even a conservative justice, would vote on curtailing their power. They might just be like, take the stupid libertarian route. I'm not sure.
I mean, the argument I would make is that they're public goods at this point.
Oh
Um,
yeah, I mean, I would say like just like take control of them, nationalize them, and call it a day. But in terms of what like a justice would do, I'm not sure.
yeah, so I do think that matters.
Hmm.
Trump appointed a bunch of. So do you think? Sorry, if jumping around. So do you think Trump's
No, go
kind
ahead.
of conversion on the pro-life issue was like legitimate?
I actually think it was partially legitimate, at least, because I remember back in the days when he would say he's pro-choice, he made it a point to emphasize how much he hates abortion. Like that was well before he really had uh, political ambitions, at least political ambitions that he would take seriously.
Okay,
So
so he would
he
say
always
like,
said he hated abortion. He hated the concept of abortion, but he took the pro-choice route. But so I think that it doesn't take it doesn't take like a, a St. Paul road to Damascus experience to go from that to, okay, maybe we should have some restrictions.
I think all it really takes, to be honest, is the first time I saw um like an ultrasound of it happening.
That
Um,
might have been what persuaded him, if
because
I
I,
remember correctly.
because like, my understanding, don't they like try to ban that? Like,
Yeah, they do. Like that's especially in this country, they really try to just make it impossible to put in any kind of even like precautionary measures. that would, even in principle, lead to maybe a reconsideration.
Right. Well,
Like, they don't even want parental approval or anything like that.
sorry for bringing up abortion so much, but that's just kind of the main hot
No,
button
I'm
issue
glad you
I
did.
find that like people talk about a lot because it. Yeah, I think part of it is a lot of like centrist or even um, I don't know. I find the pro life is even some liberal Catholics will be pro life. I find it's kind of more acceptable. Like Catholics who are liberal in every other issue will go, "Oh, I'm pro life," so I'm not like.
I'm pro-life, but I'm voting for Joe Biden because Trump killed like 200,000 Americans with COVID. That's like the line of argument I'm hearing,
Right.
which is insane.
So I kind of do think. I mean, I think regardless of how legitimate you feel Trump's religious faith is, I think he's like kind of a not practicing mainline Protestant who
Yeah.
does believe in God but isn't particularly devout.
Well, basically, what I would say is I I would boil it down to very simple terms. Is the candidate going to protect the church, or are they going to attack the church? And that is kind of the calculus that um, popes going back centuries have made, right? They would have agreements with these terrible, like personally degenerate rulers. Like, think of how degenerate of a person Charlemagne was, for example. And I'm not comparing Trump to Charlemagne, but I'm just
Mm-hmm.
saying the church was very willing to accept the authority of personally corrupt rulers if it meant her own protection.
Well, because
Like
ultimately the church
that's
will.
how
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah that's how much value they assigned to that transaction. And I actually don't think Trump is actually like that. Like, I'm not trying to say like he's some deeply just terribly immoral man. I actually don't think so. I mean, he has moral failings, but I think just calling him some kind of a moral monster
If
is
I can be
just
slightly off
ridiculous.
cover, he at least has normal moral failings in
He's
that
at
he.
least a human being.
I mean, he likes like I think our mutual friend Terrellian described it. He has like the sexual taste of a 16-year-old boy,
Yeah,
but like he likes women with big boobs and stuff, which is kind of refreshing given how many like people are like in power are pedos or like homosexuals or into like weird shit. It's kind of like with
I mean, just look at Joe Biden. You know, I mean, I'm not necessarily buying into the conspiracy theory that he's like a pedophile, but you certainly have, it really is in a sense, you have like you said, kind of the typical sexual licentiousness of Trump versus just the most unnatural of sexual vices prevalent on the other side.
like because I can't see Trump ever touching like a girl, like a
Yeah.
pre like pubes. That's just not like his thing. So like he might
I
have
mean,
had.
his vices are uh, typical, whereas the left's sexual vices are just well beyond the just the capacity of human nature.
Like
You know,
I kind of feel
just well outside, far outside the natural law. Far, I should say.
I kind of feel the same way about Silvio Berlusconi because he's really really sleazy, but at the same time it's kind of refreshing.
But again, like look how many rulers the church tolerated who had mistresses.
Hmm.
Too many to count. Okay, but again, there was that calculus: is this ruler going to protect us or is he going to fight us? And I'm not saying our current church hierarchy is making that calculus. They're not making that calculus. But as faithful Catholics, we have to make that calculus.
Well, Trump has been very clear that he's very pro-Christian,
Yeah,
regardless of
he's
how,
very pro-religious liberty.
like, regardless of how devout or undevout you think he is. He has frequently said that Christianity is a core part of America, and he
Yeah,
intends to protect it.
and I'll go back to what I was saying earlier about being anachronistic. The same-sex marriage issue too. That is a non-negotiable. But I think that issue has expanded far beyond just the issue of same-sex marriage. It's become like, do you want your kids to be taken away by child protective services if you don't, teach them about like dildos and stuff? It's terrible.
In
Terrible.
Ontario, it's legal for the government to take your kids away if you don't let them get gender reassignment surgery.
Right. So I think, like, to talk about same-sex marriage, say, oh well, Trump approved of same-sex marriage. Okay, but that issue has expanded far beyond the scope of same-sex marriage. Okay.
I mean, it's.
Like, you can make that argument in like 2005. You can't make that argument in 2020.
Yeah, I mean, and it's really sad, and it feels like we're constantly losing and fighting the last battle, and I
Yeah.
think we largely are, and that just kind of unfortunately
Mhm.
comes with the territory. But I still think whatever his personal faults are, um, Trump is better for like actual Christians of all different varieties. I think that's like objectively true.
Yeah,
Um,
I think so.
so I guess people will say though, um, once again, I think part of it is just the concern that I think part of like the clear pill thing is if we all stop voting, it'll delegitimize the system. I think
Which
is
is just ridiculous.
which I get is kind of not so much a religious issue as a political issue. My objection to that is low voter turnout doesn't delegitimize the system, it makes it worse. Because,
Yeah,
like,
I mean,
what they try to
yeah, go
do
ahead.
then is they try to lower the voter age to like 16 or 14, or they
Hmm.
change the electoral system in a way. Like, this was something Justin was trying to do in Canada. And if he had have had
Hmm.
his way, we would have had a permanent coalition between the Green Party, the Socialist Party, and his party for like the rest of Canada's existence.
I mean, that's already what they're going to do, even if you don't sit it out. Like, they're already set on lowering the voter age. They're already set uh, on just maximizing and expanding the electorate beyond recognition. They're already set on doing that, so you might as well put a stake in fighting against it in some way. I mean, I just don't see. I don't get this resistance to voting. It doesn't take much
Well, it's a
effort
free
at all.
action, is what SERP says.
What was that?
It's a free action.
Yeah, it is, and it's something that there are no moral issues with it from a standpoint of Catholic moral theology. Certainly, if so long as you're within the parameters of the non-negotiables, you take the principle that we talked about with Evangelion Vitae, and you apply it, and you vote, and then it's over with. I mean, you might not like it, but as a Catholic, I think you should have some sort of engagement in
Well,
the system, in the world, but not of it.
like in the last provincial election, for instance, so
Yeah.
the Liberal government brought in a sex ed curriculum designed by a convicted pedophile named Ben Levin. Um, so they brought that in, and the conservative government wanted to roll it back to the previous one and redevelop a new sex ed curriculum with more parental input and allow parents to opt their kids out of it. And I kind of feel if you're a religious person, that's you should probably just vote on that if nothing else. Like,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, I
it.
mean, look, as Catholics, you can be pragmatists in a certain sense, right? So long as you're not engaging in an activity that is in itself sinful, basically politics should be a sort of pragmatism that is set on making it easiest for people to get to heaven. And whatever you can do politically to achieve that is within the framework of the moral law, you should go for it.
Oh, sorry. Someone's asking, what about Trump's campaign to decriminalize homosexuality in other countries?
Yeah, I mean that's obviously terrible. I
How
will
much of
say,
that is him, and how much of that is like?
yeah, exactly. I will say there is a major disconnect between the State Department and the West Wing of the White House. Okay, a major. I mean, I would actually argue that the State Department right now is trying to level a soft coup against the sitting president, and the president has brought people on board like Rick Grinnell who are just terrible on this issue. That being said, a Biden administration would would have that times 10. It and not only internationally but domestically. Again, he would essentially try to, at least his administration would work toward making it tantamount to breaking the law to take a stand on the issue on this issue and sticking with natural law on sodomy. So whereas Trump, for all of his administration's fault on this issue, and I think there are a lot of them, and in messaging too, he's at least fighting for religious liberty policies that would protect our right
Mm-hmm.
to to hold to what we believe and live by what we believe. And there's also the fact that he is actually doing things right now by appointing new nominees to the FCC, um, which would make it very um, likely, or at least much more likely, that we might have a fighting chance against the social media tech companies. And I think that also plays into protecting our ability to propagate the faith in through the normal channels of communication.
Right.
Because if the tech companies, and not only social media companies, but also um, payment processors and and even maybe even the future utility companies, uh, if they can essentially have free reign to punish consumers on the basis of their political ideology, which would always be to punish right wing views and therefore traditional Catholic views, um, if you have a chance to fight against that in the near future, you should take it. And I actually think this administration has a plan forward to maybe do something like that. And I think that's something that you should go for.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like, as a Catholic, what if one day you reach a point where, like, the Biden Harris administration and Congress, they get together and they make it okay for a utility company, like an internet service provider, to pull the plug if you've espoused Catholic views on homosexuality. I mean, is that really outside of the realm of the foreseeable future? I don't think so.
No. So, there's that. I forget what the other. There is another major thing that I'm forgetting about. Um, oh, right, bad politicians. Okay, so a common complaint is why doesn't the church, when Biden goes for communion or when he says, "Oh, I'm a devout Catholic, I'm a practicing Catholic in good standing," why doesn't the church come out and excommunicate him or refuse him communion or something like
Hmm.
that?
Yeah, it's obviously very aggravating and frustrating, but I think we have to recognize the um, very unfortunate limitations of our current hierarchy. For one, many of them are not don't really care much about these issues. Their financial support in many ways uh, hinges on democratic politicians, and
Because doesn't the U.S. government give the Catholic Church a lot of money for, like, I think immigration programs and stuff like that?
I mean a lot of like democratically aligned organizations will yeah give money to perpetuate their the open borders policy that they've seemed to regrettably embrace. But so I think that that partially accounts for why a lot of bishops are just the, they don't have it within them in their own uh, in many cases, and even in their own personal beliefs, to even think action like that would be appropriate.
Right.
Uh, another reason would just be the fact that um, it would be inconsequential. You know, uh, you excommunicate a bishop uh, denies communion to Joe Biden, which I think actually did happen once recently, somewhat recently.
Right.
Um, you do that, and another bishop is just going to make up for that and give him communion. So, I mean, there's just the fact that it might be just futile. There's also the fact that that individual bishop might get so much blowback and uh, and he might receive so many attacks that it just might not be prudent.
Yeah, so the scenario that, and Serp and I were talking about this, that we think would happen. So let's say a bishop or someone refuses Justin Trudeau communion, or
Mm-hmm.
publicly says something like he has separated himself from the church by his actions. I think what would happen is he would just go to another priest or another bishop.
Mm-hmm.
I think you might even have a majority of the Canadian Bishops' Conference come out and say, "Oh, abortion's an issue where there could be all kinds of disagreement on. Um,
Yeah,
it's okay that he holds the views he does."
or
Uh,
just prioritize other issues by
yeah, or
feeling a
stuff.
seamless garment.
Yeah, or stuff like that. And I
Mm-hmm.
think like a majority of Catholics, including those who regularly go to church, would take the position on that. And then you'd have a schism.
Right.
And you might and then the people who lead the schism probably would be able to take like all the churches
Right.
and stuff like that. So I think that's the
And they would
issue.
probably get the monetary support to do that.
Yeah, like um, in Canada, traditionally the government provides a lot of funding to various institutions to
Hmm.
uh, for summer jobs, and that includes
Yeah.
Christian organizations. So, like the Trudeau government required them to like sign documents that they support abortion in order to get public funding. Um, Likewise, he stated that all new members of parliament of the Liberal Party have to unequivocally support abortion with like no reservations or whatever.
Wow.
So So that's kind of like the scenario that a lot of people are facing. So I'm just what I'm trying to say is there would be ample, I think, grounds to kick Justin out. The fact that he calls himself a devout Catholic kind of makes me vomit in my mouth. That being said, when he met with Pope Francis, who as I think everyone knows I'm not a fan of, he said, I talked to the leader of my faith at great length about like basically he said I lectured him about all these like hot button social issues. It's like the first and only time I felt bad for Pope Francis. Like having to turn Justin Trudeau just going off on him.
Oh boy.
Just another interesting thing. I think kind of one of the interesting, I guess, kind of notes in Catholic political history is the case of Germany, where the Catholic Church just had its own political party, um, the Catholic Center Party, and it more or less held the balance of power in German politics for like, I think the entire duration, more or less, of the German Empire.
I mean, you have sort of an attempt to do that now with I think what's called the Solidarity Party.
Yeah.
The problem with that is, I mean, it's terrible on immigration issues. I don't think it necessarily represents the actual Catholic teaching on that at all. It's the idea that as a Catholic you have to be open borders is just nonsense, and it's just trying to carve out a third party in this day and age. I think is just woefully counterproductive, especially given the stakes and the threats that we outlined earlier. I mean, it might have been very useful in the past, but now I just don't think it has much usefulness.
Okay, so I have you here, CT. I wanna spring something on you.
Okay.
Um, how can you have these fake Catholics who say they're pro-life but they support the death penalty? So, and that's kind of one of my issues with like the Solidarity Party and a lot of these people. So, where is like the standing on that? So, because
Yeah.
it's very confusing, and this
Oh, I
is
know.
this is kind of one of those things where um, it's I think one of the things about democracy and being a Catholic in this day and age is I think it's really unfair and frankly abusive that we like ask the common person to have to try to figure this shit out. Like in a lot of cases, like I
I
can't figure it
agree.
out. A lot of people who study this stuff can't figure it out. Like what's authoritative, what isn't. Um, that sort of thing like the average person's supposed to like understand like America's Middle Eastern foreign policy and that kind of thing.
It's
I,
just like insane. Most people should just be, uh, you know, uh, putting away boxes. They shouldn't be trying to figure out where Serbia and Kosovo are on a map. It's just absurd.
I'm not saying the average person's like dumb or anything.
No, I'm not saying that either. But I'm just saying that the fact I'm just fundamentally against most people uh, being politically conscious on the level that they are.
Well, as I say, like they should focus on getting married, having kids, going to work and going to church and trying to raise their
Yeah.
kids properly. And that's traditionally what their job is, and that does way more good than a lot of spurgs on the internet talking about their perfect society. Um,
Absolutely.
so, like, I just, when we get into, like, and he's been a bit quiet for a while, but when we got into, like, Catholics, we're saying Pope Francis said this is the doctrine now. I mean, this stuff is all really difficult to, like, figure out.
I can speak to that a bit.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Uh, what's important to recognize, first of all, is that like for example, when he issued out that change in the catechism, um, one would say, okay, well, that is what we would call authentic ordinary magisterium. Uh, Even if that is the case, I insist that the church has already prior infallibly decreed that the death penalty is in principle licit. And
Mm-hmm.
I think you can find that from Leo X's encyclical Exsurge Domine, where he says, where he lays out very clearly that uh, the death penalty is not opposed to the will of the Spirit. Uh, and that was a document that was decreed uh, to apply to the whole church. It came with the condemnation. It uh, pertained to faith and morals. So that is at a magisterial level that is at basically maximum authority.
Right.
Uh, and if you come into a position where you find something in just the authentic ordinary magisterium, which is fallible, even if it ordinarily commands assent, if you come across something that contradicts more authoritative magisterium, you have to fall in with with the more authoritative magisterium, and you know it's authoritative by how the decrees are issued out. And with that, um, at that point, it's no different than John the 22nd saying that the souls of the just don't see God until the end of time. Uh, that was heretical by virtue of what had prior to that been established as doctrine by more authoritative magisterium. So I would apply that principle to this issue of the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say about his recent encyclical, just like Laudato Si, he manifestly expressed an intention not to address this specifically to the church, but to address it as a invitation to dialogue with the entire world. When he does that, he pretty much uh, um, disqualifies that whole text from being magisterial, because a magisterial text has to be addressed to the church as something to be bound to the faithful.
Mm-hmm.
He has to be acting within the capacity as universal shepherd of the church, of the flock. When you're just inviting dialogue with the entire planet, that that is not operating in that capacity, categorically speaking. And it's not just the way that he likes to address encyclicals, because his first encyclical, Lumen Fide, did address the church explicitly. Whereas the last two, Laudato Si, made an explicit point that it was not addressing the church; it was addressing the whole planet. And I think this is in that same spirit. And so I would actually say that Amoris Laetitia, which was his exhortation on the family, which had that controversial statement about divorce and remarriage, that is at a higher magisterial level than this recent encyclical, which I don't even think it meets the the qualification of magisterium by virtue of that missing essential component.
Right. I'm just saying, I think to the average Catholic, like, that's pretty complicated and difficult to
It
understand.
is. If I wanted to phrase it a better way, I guess I would just say, in his encyclical, he made it a point that he wasn't adding to the magisterium of what ought to be believed, and he was just
That was his
giving,
opinion, basically?
offering reflections to all people of goodwill. And I think most people can understand that if
Yeah.
you phrase it that way. But I take your point.
Yeah, just like, or I guess I'd say that it was kind of his personal opinion on how he thinks it should be
Yeah,
interpreted.
and he was kind of saying that, he's saying like, I'm offering my reflections as an invitation to dialogue with all people of goodwill. You read that and it's like, does that sound like what popes used to say, where it's like, we defy, decree, and and pronounce that dun, 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 and that this is to be definitively held by all the church's faithful, and whosoever does not agree, let him be. It's just manifestly not in that same vein.
Right. But yeah, like I said, it's I don't know.
I will. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I feel bad, like just for the
Yeah.
average person who has to
Oh, yeah. It's
not just
terrible.
deal with that, but like deal with like all these really complicated political, like I sat
Mhm.
down a little bit and tried to understand it. I could not understand what Trump was impeached over.
Right.
I don't know if like
I don't
any
even think they know.
like it was the most like bizarre. I thought it was just going to be abuse of power or something like that because that would have at least made sense. But it was like this weird Ukraine thing. Um, but I don't know. It's I'm kind of worried. Just maybe I guess just talking a little more practically. Do you have any predictions for the election?
Um. Well, I will say, while the polling has been terrible lately, I think every other metric that you would use, such as whether it be voter registrations or the enthusiasm gap or the primary model, all of these other reliable metrics point in Trump's direction, uh, and it's not even close. Like, I mean, you look at voter registrations in Pennsylvania. I think they're up like it's like a 2-to-1 margin. Democrats are seem to be gaining in some suburban areas in like Chester, but other than that, Republicans are way up in voter registrations in Pennsylvania. Which is, if Trump wins Pennsylvania, then it's pretty much game over because he's good in Florida. I mean, his Hispanic share is through the roof in Florida, and if he gets Florida and he keeps North Carolina, and he's obviously going to get Ohio, and Iowa looks good. Then if he gets Pennsylvania, I think we're at 269 with Maine second, and
Is that
if
with or
that,
without Arizona?
yeah, that is even without Arizona. Um, if you that's under a scenario of him losing Arizona, then you're at 269. And if you're at 269, Republicans control most of the state delegations that would be able to put him over the top. So even if it's like a 269 issue, he would still win, and all he would need is Pennsylvania. And if he gets Arizona, then he only needs one Midwestern state. He only needs either Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania, and he would be at 270 with Maine's second congressional district. So I mean, everyone likes to talk about how Trump has to run the table. I don't think so. I think Biden has to run the table. I think he has to get like every Midwestern state or get Arizona and most Midwestern states. So
Because
I mean, I think so. From a structural standpoint, I say Trump is favored. The polling has been terrible, but I mean, with the polling, I think there are a lot of systemic issues with polling in this cycle. I think they're not reaching the people that they need to reach. They're not very well distributed in terms of a geographic distribution for polling. They're not. There's also social desirability bias, which I think is much higher than it was in 2016
mm-hmm.
because of the riots. So I would obviously try to keep a watch for the polls that were accurate last cycle, like the Trafalgar Group and uh, Emerson polling was pretty good, and uh, some others. But so overall, I think that he has a good chance. I don't know what's going to happen. Uh, the mail-in ballots is very troubling and worrying. Um, and this could not be an election day. It could just be like an election war. And whoever uh, whoever has more resources to just either stay in power or overthrow the incumbent, I think will probably win out. I don't even know if voting is going to necessarily be the determining factor. It might just be like which candidate has the most resources to hold on to power. I don't know. What do you
Right,
think?
because this time last cycle, Clinton was up 6 points. Um, Ultimately, she won by two. But the actual last week of polls was pretty accurate. Um, Nationally, I think the state polls were off.
State polls were terrible.
I do kind of feel that they are actually rigging it this time. Because I saw a CNN
Yeah,
one that had Biden up
Biden
16
up
points.
16. He's he's not winning by 16. Okay, like there's just no way. And I think part of that is because when Trump was hospitalized, I don't think Trump supporters were willing to answer a poll at that time, and you probably had a rush to. You probably had a Biden supporters rushing to respond to a poll at that time. That might partially account for it, but
Hmm.
but I think you're right. I think they're rigged. I think what they're trying to do is have as many of these media polls skew it for Biden so that they can justify mail-in voting.
Because I mean, once again, that the national polls were accurate in the last week, but they kind of sucked up till then. My prediction is I think what's going to happen is Trump's going to win
Mm-hmm.
election night, and then they're just going to keep finding or losing mail-in ballots till Biden wins. Um,
Yeah, I will say about that. Um, it might not be as straightforward as as we fear because recently it seems to be that Republicans are actually doing okay in the the in how many mail-in ballots they're sending,
really? Okay, that's
and,
interesting.
and they're actually way over. They dramatically overestimated how many people would do this mail-in ballot thing. I think they thought it was going to be like 80 million. Right now, it seems to be like 38 million or something like that. And there's also the fact that while they're obviously going to try to rig it, going to try to like find as many votes that they need after election day. Uh, I wonder if the fact that Trump has basically like scared his base into like all voting in person, and Biden has basically scared his base away from the polls, if that would just lead to like so many mail-in ballots just getting rejected that they might not even be able to rig it enough. I don't know.
Yeah, I know.
I don't know if that makes any sense.
I don't know the last time I actually voted on election day. I normally vote in an advance poll.
But like you look at the polls and it's pretty clear that I think upwards of 60% of Biden supporters say they're voting by mail and like 80% of Trump supporters say they're voting in person. So when you have that much of a deficit and the fact that even with rigging a lot of mail-in ballots are going to get rejected, I wonder if they kind of like just screwed themselves over. I don't know.
Because I know I had to do mail in ballot because I voted in
Yeah.
the conservative leadership elections. And I probably screwed it up because I just got confused. It is kind of a lot of it's a lot more complicated than
And
it
like how many like typical Biden supporters are might just forget to send it in or like just like forget about it. You know, I think it's a mistake to even if you can rely on like massive rigging. I think it's a mistake to have like most of your base voting in this way. I don't think it even with rigging. I'm not sure it'll help you. It might actually hurt you. I don't know.
because I think Biden's a much weaker candidate than Hillary. Um,
Yeah, he is. I mean, he's more likable, but I think he's he's not as
Hillary is
competent.
really smart. I think you can say she's
Yeah,
evil, you can say all these things, but Hillary is a very savvy operator.
she
Um,
is. Yeah,
Biden is
she
not.
has it. She has the instinct.
And like, I could see her actually doing the job of president, whereas Biden
Mhm.
is literally just like a corpse, like a Weekend at Bernie type scenario. Um, that sort of
Yeah.
thing. So, I mean, Joe is kind of like your drunken old uncle who just talks a lot of nonsense. So, like, he seems like he's a more likable person, but I don't know. I think what happens is if the Adderall doesn't work at one of the debates, uh,
And even the debates are in limbo right now.
yeah, um,
Third one is probably going to happen, but the second one is definitely in limbo.
mm-hmm,
So we'll see. But I think you're right on all that.
right. So I didn't really have anything else to bring up. Was there anything else, other points you wanted to make?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the last thing I would just say is, if you're a Catholic in America, I would say just straightforwardly, you should vote for Trump,
Mm-hmm.
just based on everything we talked about. I think it's a no-brainer, frankly.
I think even if you're in a blue state, the popular vote matters in terms of legitimacy.
Yeah,
Um,
like if Biden loses the election electorally, but he's like up 5 points or something in the popular, that would be a problem.
yeah, so even if you live in California or something, there's still like a lot of
Yeah,
Republican voters in those states. And like, don't get me wrong, I know there's a lot of
right.
problems with the Republicans. I personally really disagree with their position on healthcare. Um,
Oh yeah, it's abysmal.
uh,
I will say Trump is kind of changing it a little bit in rhetoric, but
mhm.
like
Like,
he's basically made it impossible to be a Republican and say you're not going to cover people with pre-existing conditions, which is pretty big.
like I personally support public or single payer.
Hmm.
Myself, I think that's one of those things where I do think, from a Christian standpoint, we have a moral responsibility to try to provide people with things like healthcare if we're able to. But once again, I don't think it's any particular mechanism is
Right, and I think that's pretty much in line with what Leo the 13th would say.
like if we can feed starving people, like if we have the
Yeah,
resources to do that. But
yeah,
yeah. So I think that's about it. Thank you very much for coming on. I enjoyed it. We got through a lot of material pretty in a pretty efficient amount of time.
yeah. I had fun, man. Always good talking to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Check out Classical Theist Channel. I have a link, and I will post it also in the chat. Um, God bless, my friend. Stay safe.
You too.
Okay, everybody. So I hope you enjoyed that. Maybe I'll try to have Classical Theist on again soon. I'm sure there's lots of issues we can have, but I figured that was kind of a good thing to do for the election. So I just wanted to say, God bless everyone. Try to stay safe out there. The whole world's just kind of has gone nuts. Talk to you guys real soon.